I crashed my wife's romantic dinner with another man and handed her the divorce letter, and she was frantic when she read it, because she saw I wouldn't beg or argue, I would just end it. The restaurant fell silent when I left the envelope on the table and said, "You don't have to explain anything to me, I already understand everything." I left with my head held high, even though my heart was breaking. And in that moment, as the waiter trembled with the bottle of wine poised in midair, as her lover lowered his eyes, trying to find the courage he never had to be a real man on the floor, as she trembled with her hands over the letter, the world seemed to stop, frozen in an eternal instant of shame, silence, and end. The end of everything we built. The end of everything she threw away. The end of me, but also the birth of who I needed to be to survive that pain. Because no one talks about the sound love makes when it breaks. It's not just the sound of crying. It's the sound of a soul breaking. It's the sound of an empty room. The sound of a toothbrush being picked up from the sink, a ring spinning on the glass nightstand. It's the sound of absence in every corner of the house, of her laughter that stopped echoing, of her scent that lingered on my pillow for more weeks than I could bear. She said she loved me. She said it easily, with a sweet voice and calm eyes. And that's why it hurt so much. Because the love she claimed to feel wasn't enough to keep her by my side. It wasn't strong enough to keep her faithful. And when love isn't enough to keep someone, it was never love. Or at least, it wasn't hers for me. That night, I already knew. She had changed. Small details. New excuses, a different perfume, the distance in her touch. The cell phone she never let go of. The lost look in her eyes when she saw me arrive. The kiss that was no longer in a hurry to happen. But betrayal, even when suspected, still cuts like a new knife. Confirmation is a cold, cruel blade that tears apart in silence. And even though I had prepared myself for that moment, when I saw them together at the table, laughing like teenagers, my chest sank as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. She laughed like she hadn't laughed at me in months. As if the best of herself had been reserved for him. As if I were just the life she wanted to forget. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't beg. I just walked over, left the envelope with the signature already made, looked her in the eyes, and said what I needed to say. You don't have to explain anything to me, I already understand everything. And that's when she knew, I wasn't going to fight. I wasn't going to ask her to stay. I wasn't going to humiliate myself for someone who chose another path. She opened the letter hurriedly, her fingers trembling, her eyes widening as she read line by line, seeing that everything was already there, the end, the separation of assets, joint custody of the dog, the lawyer's address. Everything ready. Everything calculated. Everything definitive. And the despair didn't come from being caught. It came because she realized I wouldn't back down. I left. I left with shaky legs, but with my soul struggling to stay upright. And I swear, the air felt heavier outside. But I knew I couldn't look back. Because if I did, I wouldn't leave. If I heard her voice calling me, I would crumble. So I walked. One step at a time. A world crumbling inside, but with my head held high as if there was still something in me worth saving. The following days were torture. Sleeping became an act of courage. Eating, an obligation. Working, a botched escape. And every corner of the house carried the memory of what had been ours. Her chair still had her coat thrown on it. Her favorite glass was still in the sink. The car playlist still played our songs. Her soul still lived in the corners. And worst of all, even knowing about the betrayal, there was still love in me. A stubborn, hurt, foolish love. A love that still hoped it was all a lie. That she would show up at the door saying it was a mistake, an impulse, that her lover meant nothing. But she didn't show up. And over time, love turned to mourning. But time, that impartial scoundrel, taught me to move on. And when the pain stopped screaming and became a whisper, I began to breathe weightlessly. And when her name stopped hurting, I began to remember myself. Who I was before I lost myself in her. Who I wanted to be. And then, slowly, like someone learning to walk again, I found myself again. That's when she appeared again. Months later. As if nothing had happened. As if that dinner had never happened. As if the divorce decree was just a clerical error. She knocked on my door with wet eyes and an apology on the tip of her tongue. She said she regretted it the moment she saw me leave. That her lover was empty, superficial. That nothing made sense without me. That she traded an entire love for a shallow distraction. That she saw in my eyes, that night, the man she lost, and that she only realized it when it was too late. I listened to it all in silence. Like a judge listening to the final plea before sentencing. And when she finished, waiting for me to say something, I just smiled. A sad smile, but one of peace. Because it no longer hurt. Because I had already started over. There was someone. Someone with a gentle presence and sincere eyes. Someone who didn't need to be perfect, just needed to be real. And she was. And it was with her that I discovered what it meant to love without fear. I told her I forgave her. Not to get back together. But to free her. To bring closure. To lay the final stone on the grave of what was. Because love dies. And what remains is what's built afterward. She cried. But they were lonely tears. The tears of someone who realizes there's no going back when the other has learned to move on. A few weeks later, I ran into her again by chance. And that's when everything changed. Because for the first time, she saw me smiling. A real smile. A light, full smile. I was holding another woman's hand, walking slowly, and there was a peace in me that had never existed in our last years. And she, across the street, stood still. Her eyes wide. Her mouth half open. Her heart, perhaps, in pieces. I saw it. I felt it. Because what she saw there was a reflection of what she had lost. And in that moment, she finally understood that no one else would see her the way I did. The lover. It was already past. A forgotten name. A colorless memory. She tried to pretend she was fine, that she was moving on, that she was happy. But her gaze knew no lies. And there, faced with what she'd lost, she fell silent. And me? I moved on. Because there are things that can't be recovered. Loves that can't be repeated. And decisions that, once made, condemn us to live with the consequences. But there was still something to come. Something she never imagined. A twist of fate. A silent but devastating twist. Something that would put an end, not only to our story, but to her hope of one day being seen by me in the same light. And when that happened, even her silence screamed. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is romanticized or justified. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry hard truths, because betrayal it doesn't just hurt, she destroys lives, homes, trust and true loves. Each narrative is a mirror of the choices and consequences that no one wants to experience, but many provoke. Now take a deep breath. Get ready. You are about to hear a shocking, intense and unforgettable story. His name was Ethan, hers, Claire. Two simple names, but they carried the weight of a story that began with an unpretentious encounter at a corner cafe on a random September afternoon. There was no movie scene, no cinematic glances with music playing in the background. Just a coincidence of schedules, a long line, and the chance occurrence of her dropping her cell phone. Ethan caught it before it hit the floor. Claire smiled with the gratitude of someone who didn't expect kindness from a stranger. And in that smile, he saw a peace he couldn't find anywhere else. She wasn't the kind of woman who drew attention wherever she went. Not that she wasn't beautiful, she was, but what really stood out was the calmness in her eyes, her soft voice, and the way she listened as he spoke, as if every word mattered. She liked details, comfortable silence, listening more than talking. Ethan, on the other hand, came from a chaotic routine, surrounded by noisy people, quick decisions, constant pressure. Claire was the respite he didn't know he needed. They began with casual conversations that soon turned into dates turned into weekends together, and before they knew it, the empty spaces in each other's routines no longer existed. It was as if the world had fallen into place, as if everything before had been merely the prologue to a story that was finally beginning to be written with real ink. Claire was the kind of woman who brought order to chaos, not with impositions, but with presence. Ethan thirsted for stability, and she gave it to him like someone offering shelter on a stormy day. She filled the house with plants she learned to care for online, organized books by color, watched too many documentaries, and cried over stories she'd never even heard. He liked to see her laughing to herself with text messages, immersed in novels, or jotting down notes in notebooks she never showed anyone. Ethan was a civil engineer, methodical, focused, and with a reserved manner that sometimes confused people. Claire said he was all emotion inside, but afraid to show it. With her, little by little, he allowed himself to be less rigid, more relaxed. Even though the work was demanding, he never lost the habit of making her breakfast on Sundays, always with scrambled eggs just the way she liked them and overdone toast, because she said she preferred it crispy. Claire, for her part, was a literature teacher at a local school. She loved what she did with a rare intensity, and often came home telling stories about her students as if they were characters in a book in progress. Ethan listened to everything, laughing at her imitations, the unusual situations of everyday life, the way she was enchanted by the ordinary. It was this enchantment with life that made him fall in love with her all over again every day. Their relationship was made of small gestures, not grand declarations. It was the note left on the fridge, the coat purposely forgotten only to return and receive another kiss, the exchange of glances in the middle of a conversation with friends, as if only the two of them existed in the world. Birthdays were always at home, with simple dinners and improvised desserts. The first apartment they shared was small, but had large windows through which the sun streamed in, illuminating the mornings when they stayed in bed longer than they should have. And even with the difficulties of the beginning, the tight bills, the borrowed furniture, the noise from the neighbor who spoke too loudly, there was a sense of construction, of a shared project. As if they were shaping something bigger than themselves. Friends said they were a good match. Not because they were similar, but because they balanced each other out. Ethan with his almost mathematical practicality, Claire with her soul made of poetry. Their trips were planned by her, but organized by him. She chose places for their stories, he for their comfort and security. And amid their differences, they always found their way back to each other. No relationship is made up of only good times, and they also had their crises. Some quieter, others more heated. There were periods when Ethan's work was so demanding that he could barely eat dinner at home, and Claire, though understanding, felt alone. There was a time when she considered pursuing a master's degree in another city, and he feared losing what had taken so long to build. But in each of these phases, their love seemed stronger than their disagreements. They chose each other again. And that was what mattered. After 5 years of marriage, they bought a bigger house. Claire wanted a garden. Ethan wanted space for an office. It was a house with a porch, trees out front, and quiet neighbors. The move marked a new cycle. A phase in which they began to talk about children, about the future. She started painting again, something she'd done before becoming a teacher. He encouraged her, saying he loved seeing her with paint in her hands, even if it made a mess. Claire talked about opening a small bookstore, a long-time dream, and Ethan listened with eyes full of pride, even if worried about reality. They made plans. And even on ordinary days, there was a sense of mutual security. As if they were on the same side, always. At Sunday lunches, Claire would talk about books, about characters who resembled real people, and Ethan would make sarcastic comments about how her stories were always too sad. She would laugh, saying the sad stories were more beautiful. And he would say he preferred the happy ones because he'd seen too much sadness in real life. In those moments, there was something vulnerable in his eyes, and Claire would embrace him as if she understood without needing to ask. She'd always had that gift, of understanding without intruding. Of listening to his silence and knowing what was there. That was why he loved her so much. Or at least, that's what he believed. But there were also small changes. Nothing that sounded like an immediate warning, just nuances. The quicker kiss, the text that took a long time to be answered, fatigue justifying absences. Ethan started working more, losing track of deadlines. Claire started going to bed earlier, saying she was exhausted. Their conversations became shorter. They didn't fight, but the silence between them began to grow longer. He attributed it to the weight of routine, to this phase, to adult life that demands too much. And he tried to compensate with flowers on random days, dinners out, attempts to recapture the spark that seemed to be fading. She smiled, thanked him, but something in her gaze remained distant. As if she were there, but not entirely. Ethan began to observe more. Not suspiciously, but with the look of someone who senses something is missing and tries to understand what. Claire was becoming more vain, which wasn't a problem, on the contrary, he liked seeing her confident. But there was an air of mystery in her gestures, something she'd never had before. Little white lies began to emerge, vague explanations about where she'd been, laughs into the phone that ended with the screen facing down. He tried to ignore them, tried to trust them, but intuition, even when silent, screamed somewhere in his body. Even so, he carried on. He continued loving, continuing to invest, continuing to believe. He cooked dinner even when he was tired, listened to her stories even when she seemed absent. He remembered birthdays, the little details. He tried to rekindle what was slowly beginning to fade. Claire, for her part, seemed torn between two worlds. There was an emotional exhaustion in her that Ethan no longer knew how to reach. A kind of distance that no trip together, no gesture of affection, no conversation seemed capable of bridging. Still, the house was alive. There were still pictures on the walls, occasional laughter, movie nights with popcorn on the couch. There were still moments when everything felt normal. And that was exactly what made it so confusing. Because the line between love and loss isn't always clear. And often, by the time you realize it, you're already on the edge, balancing between what was and what still insists on being. And then came restaurant night. The date had been set for weeks. A special dinner, she'd suggested it herself. A new, more sophisticated place, with reservations made in advance. Ethan had gone to the tailor days before, carefully choosing his shirt. It wasn't just about the outfit, it was about trying to impress, to perhaps rekindle something. To show he was still worth it. He believed in it. He believed love endured. And when he walked into that place, his heart aching, nothing in the world could prepare him for what he was about to find. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could prevent the silence that would take over everything in the next moment. But this is a part of the story that will only be revealed when it is impossible to ignore. Because before the end, it is necessary to understand what was being lost little by little. No shouting. No warnings. Only with the cruel silence of choices yet to be made. Autumn seemed to have arrived early that year, and with it, a kind of silence settled between them as gently as the leaves falling in the garden Claire tended so carefully. Ethan sensed the distance, but didn't confront it directly. Instead, he increased his efforts. He tried to revive small rituals, like making pancakes on Saturdays, leaving flowers in her car with handwritten notes, or planning a weekend getaway. Claire thanked him with restrained gestures, but the sparkle that once danced in her eyes now seemed shy, almost absent. They still slept together, still shared a bed, cutlery, and the calendar on the fridge, but they no longer shared dreams. It was as if they lived on opposite sides of a thick glass pane, where they could see but not touch each other. Ethan, though he wouldn't admit it even to himself, felt increasingly alone, even indoors. Conversations became messages, kisses became formal, and the silences between them began to weigh more heavily than any word spoken. Nights no longer ended with lingering hugs, and mornings became too rushed. He said he needed to leave early, she said she needed more sleep. Sundays became spaces of distraction, each occupying a different corner of the house, with acceptable excuses, but which only served to mask an uncomfortable truth: they were losing each other and didn't know how to find each other again. Ethan tried to deny what he felt, telling himself it was just a phase, that love doesn't die so suddenly. He tried to convince himself that Claire loved him, albeit in a different way. More mature, perhaps. More silent. More discreet. But the truth is, when love cools for no apparent reason, it usually has a different blanket. Ethan started leaving work later, holding meetings that could have been held via email, all to postpone the moment of returning home. Because returning home was no longer returning to her. It was returning to the emptiness that had once been warmth. Claire, for her part, had also changed her habits. She began arriving more dressed up than usual, offering vague excuses for delays that hadn't happened before. She'd say she'd gotten lost in traffic, that she'd decided to stop at a new coffee shop, that she'd gone to see an exhibition alone. Ethan listened to everything, and even without saying a word, he began mentally filing away every little detail. She had created a world where he didn't fit. And that, more than any physical absence, hurt unbearably. One night, while Claire was taking a shower, her phone vibrated on the nightstand. Ethan, until then, had never considered looking. But in that moment, as if his intuition was finally tired of being ignored, he allowed himself to. All it took was a notification on the screen for all that remained of innocence to begin to crumble. There was no name, just a heart and the phrase, "dreaming about you since yesterday." Ethan froze. Time slowed. Each heartbeat seemed to ache in his chest, as if he could hear his own blood boiling. When Claire emerged from the bathroom, she found the room dark, her phone still there, and Ethan already turned to the side, as if asleep. She didn't notice anything. Or pretended not to notice. And that's when something inside him changed. He didn't react. He didn't confront her. He didn't ask. Because deep down, he already knew there was no answer that would erase the wound that was open at that moment. Betrayal, once confirmed, doesn't need to be explained. It just needs to be digested. And Ethan began to swallow the truth as slowly as someone taking poison little by little. In the days that followed, he observed with different eyes. Small gestures took on new meaning. The time she spent in the bathroom with her cell phone, the laughter too quiet to be spontaneous, the way she dressed to buy wine, the hidden nervousness when he asked where she'd been. Ethan became a spectator of his own life, watching, scene by scene, the end of a story he still couldn't accept. Anger came, but it came silently. It was a calm anger, of someone who knows they've lost but doesn't want to destroy anything. Of someone who, even wounded, wants to leave with dignity. He didn't want war. He just wanted the chance to retreat before losing what little of himself he still had. It was then that Claire suggested dinner. A new, elegant restaurant, more sophisticated than the ones they usually frequented. She seemed excited, almost nervous, as if she wanted to impress. She said she needed to reconnect, that they were distant, that she missed them both. Ethan watched her with a mixture of amazement and resignation. She spoke as if she believed in her own performance. And he accepted the invitation. Not out of hope. But because he already knew it would be the last chapter of the story he built with such care. That night, he prepared himself as if he were going to a farewell party. He chose his clothes calmly, applied perfume, and styled his hair more carefully. In the inside pocket of his jacket, he placed the already signed divorce document. Not on impulse. But because he understood there was no point in talking anymore, nor trying to salvage what she had already destroyed with her choices. He arrived at the restaurant ahead of schedule, observed the crowds, and took a deep breath. His heart pounded, but his steps were steady. When he saw Claire, already seated, laughing and leaning toward the man in front of her, his world seemed to collapse. Not out of surprise, but out of realization. She had made the promise a thing of the past. Her laugh was light, intimate, complicit. The kind of laugh he hadn't heard in a long time. And there, in that moment, all his suspicions were confirmed with cruel clarity. Claire wasn't just absent. She already belonged to another universe. Ethan walked toward the table with the calm of someone who knows they're in control of their own grief. He stopped in front of them, took the envelope from his pocket, placed it on the table, and said in the firmest voice he could muster, "You don't need to explain anything to me. I already understand everything." The silence that fell around him was absolute. The music stopped playing in his head, the cutlery seemed to cease on every table, the air grew heavy as if the world were holding its breath. Claire's eyes widened, confused, pale, as if watching her own lie crumble before everyone. The man, lacking the courage to look at him, looked away like a teenager caught red-handed. Ethan didn't wait for an answer. He turned and left, his posture erect, his stride firm, his heart in ruins, but his soul protected by the dignity he still had left. Behind him, Claire opened the envelope with trembling hands. She read the divorce letter line by line, and when she got to the part where everything was already settled, where there was no room for negotiation, for explanations, for promises of change, her eyes filled with despair. The penny dropped. She had no chance of reversing it. Ethan wouldn't scream, wouldn't cry, wouldn't argue. He would just leave. As he had. Without looking back. But that wasn't the end. There was still one final piece to be moved in this silent game of loss and choice. Something Claire could never have imagined. A twist that still awaited her, hidden in the shadows of the aftermath. A detail that would change everything. And when she finally discovered it, even her silence would be unbearable. The news spread quickly among familiar faces, like everything tragic and too intimate to be shared without a heavy voice. It wasn't just a separation. There was something about that ending that carried a dense atmosphere, as if it were the culmination of a long, silent, and painful fall. For many, Ethan was the betrayed man. For a few, he was the man who knew how to keep quiet and walk away with his dignity intact. But what no one knew, not even Claire, was what lurked beneath the surface of that restrained reaction, that silent departure. There was more to that restaurant exit than a broken heart. There was a truth kept under lock and key. And like all silenced truths, it carried a weight that needed, sooner or later, to fall on those who deserved to feel it. Time passed. Enough for Ethan to relearn how to live. Gradually, the pain stopped biting and began to burn, then to annoy, until it became just a memory. He moved on. Truly. He began to smile again, to talk without fear, to sleep peacefully. You met someone. Not like someone filling a void, but like someone rediscovering an inner space you thought was dead. The new woman had a light that didn't dim, but warmed. She was calm, honest, with sincere eyes. She never needed to promise anything because she was wholehearted in everything she did. Ethan fell in love again, but this time, with a different maturity. Without idealizations. Just with presence. With truth. And that simplicity was what healed him. As for Claire, she felt time differently. Her lover didn't last long. A few weeks after dinner at the restaurant, he disappeared from her life as if he'd never existed. No explanation. Just silence. He didn't return calls, didn't reply to messages. He simply vanished. The freedom she believed she was seeking so desperately proved to be a piercing loneliness. She began frequenting the same places she'd gone with Ethan, trying to feel something familiar. She visited old friends, sought comfort in empty conversations. The apartment, now hers alone, seemed bigger than ever. And not in a good way. She sat at the table and stared at the empty chair, as if it could give her back the years she'd wasted. Some nights, she woke up crying without knowing why. Other nights, she dreamed of Ethan smiling and woke with a wet face and a tight chest. But what hurt most was knowing he was no longer there. Not out of pride. But out of self-love. Unsure where else to seek peace, Claire decided to seek him out. Not with the intention of getting back together, or at least that's what she told herself, but with the desire to apologize. To try to explain what she couldn't even explain. The betrayal, she said, wasn't due to a lack of love, but to an inner emptiness she couldn't name. Ethan agreed to meet her. They were at a simple cafe downtown. She arrived first, he a little later. When she saw him, her heart raced. There was a disconcerting serenity about him. The kind of peace she'd never been able to achieve. Ethan greeted her kindly, but without intimacy. She felt the weight of her new place in his life. It was now just history. Claire tried to begin. You said you were sorry. That you hadn't been able to sleep since that night. That you thought every day about everything you'd lost. Ethan listened patiently, respectfully. When she finished, he waited a moment before speaking. His voice was firm, without hurt, but with a deep weariness. He said he didn't want to hear excuses, that what had been done could never be undone. But he was grateful for the request. And that he forgave her. Not for her sake. But for his. Because forgiveness was what was needed to bring that story to a definitive end. Claire smiled with tears in her eyes, as if receiving a blessing. But there was more to that conversation. Something Ethan hadn't yet said. And this, no matter how much I'd avoided it for months, needed to be revealed. He took a deep breath. He looked into her eyes and then spoke. He said there was something she didn't know. Something that happened days before dinner at the restaurant. Claire stared at him, confused. Ethan said that one morning, after another silent night between them, he went for a walk earlier than usual. He needed to breathe, clear his mind, distance himself from the anguish he felt. He walked aimlessly, crossing streets he didn't usually pass through. And then, as if by chance, or fate, as you prefer, he spotted a familiar figure in the distance. It was Claire. Sitting in the same coffee shop where they'd met, but she wasn't alone. She was smiling. But it wasn't just any smile. It was that smile. The same one he hadn't seen in months. The one that had once been his alone. She was smiling at another man. She held his hand across the table, and for a moment, her face rested on the stranger's shoulder. Ethan did nothing. He didn't approach. He didn't take a picture. He didn't confront her. He just watched. For 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours. Then he turned his back and walked away. Claire was silent, her face pale, her eyes fixed. Ethan continued. He said it was at that moment that he understood. That nothing he could say to her would change what was already happening. She had already made her choice. She just hadn't had the courage to tell her. And so he decided not to fight. Not to beg. Just to let go. He said he spent the next few days in silence not because he didn't feel it, but because he needed to find a way to get out of it whole. And the only way was to accept it. And move on. Claire, now teary-eyed, tried to respond, but couldn't. Ethan continued. He said that, upon seeing that scene, he didn't feel anger. He felt grief. For the love they'd built. For the trust that had died. For the history she'd thrown away without warning. But he also said that, at the same time, he felt relief. Because in that moment, he saw clearly who she was. And who he would become from then on. She tried to say something, but her voice faltered. She wanted to say it meant nothing, that it was a mistake, that she was confused, that the other person wasn't important. But the words lost their meaning in the face of Ethan's firmness. And then he finished. He said he would never wish her harm. That he hoped she found the peace she so desperately sought. But that the pain she caused would forever be part of his own story. That he moved on. That he was happy. Not out of revenge. But because he deserved it. Because rebuilding herself was the only option when everything fell apart. Claire was crying now, openly. Her hands trembled on the table, her gaze lost. But Ethan no longer carried her weight. He calmly stood up, straightened his coat, and said goodbye. He said, "Take care," and meant it. She tried to take his hand, but he gently pulled away. He left the cafe with the same firm stride as months before. But this time, there was no pain. Just lightness. And then Claire looked around. The same place where it all began. Now it was the scene of the end. And for the first time, she felt the emptiness she had allowed to grow. Because in that cafe, the man who had once looked at her as if she were the world had just left. And with him, he took everything she would never have again. But fate, as always, still had one last irony in store. Something she would only discover too late. Something that would not only confirm the loss, but make it definitive. And irreversible. Claire didn't leave the cafe for hours that day. After Ethan left, she remained with her hands clasped on the table, staring into space, as if trying to internally reorganize everything she had just heard. Her eyes still burned, her throat insisted on closing, but it wasn't the crying that occupied her anymore. It was emptiness. A hopeless silence. The kind of silence that expects no return, no forgiveness, no understanding. What Ethan had said hurt her not just because of the coldness with which it was said, but because of its lucidity. He wasn't there to hurt her, and perhaps that was even more painful. He was at peace. And that was the true sentence. The absence of pain in him screamed louder than any words could. And now, she was condemned to his absence. In the days that followed, Claire tried to focus on work, on her routine, on the little things. But everything felt out of place. The school seemed colder, the books less interesting, the hallways narrower. The students' faces blurred, and for the first time in years, she forgot what she'd read in class. At home, the silence seemed amplified. The rooms held memories in every corner, and even the smell of his soap still clung to the bathroom tiles. It was as if, even outside, Ethan was everywhere. And precisely because he was everywhere, it was impossible to forget him. The nights became unbearable. The pillow lost all comfort, and the clock seemed to mock her insomnia. Claire instinctively reached for her cell phone, but there was no one to text. She flipped through old photos with the care of someone handling broken glass, and wept silently. She called her sister, tried to justify her absence at a family lunch, and heard only the dry voice on the other end saying there was nothing left to explain. "You lost the best man I ever knew," were the words that echoed after the line dropped. And with them, another piece of her world fell apart. What Claire didn't yet know was that fate, ever observant and cruel in its punctuality, was still preparing the final blow. The true weight of her choices was yet to come. Unsure of where else to hold on, she decided to head to the bookstore where she knew Ethan usually spent his Saturday afternoons. She expected to find him alone, perhaps leafing through a technical book or sitting in the back with a coffee. She wanted to watch him from afar, just to see if there was still any room for improvement. She arrived early, and her heart raced when she saw him enter minutes later. But he wasn't alone. There was a woman beside him. Tall, with her hair tied in an unassuming bun, she smiled naturally as she spoke to him. Ethan smiled back. It wasn't a polite or friendly smile. It was a full smile. A serene, knowing smile, filled with intimacy. Claire froze. Her chest tightened with an intensity that made her body instinctively recoil. She watched, hidden between the shelves, as the two walked among the books, exchanging glances, sharing silent comments, as if their language was unique. He slipped his arm around the woman's back naturally, pulling her gently closer when she laughed too loudly. It was a slight gesture, but deeply intimate. And in that moment, Claire understood. Ethan hadn't just followed. He'd found something new. Someone who now occupied the space that had once been hers. Unaware of what she was doing, she left unseen, her hands trembling and her eyes brimming with tears. She wandered the streets aimlessly, feeling her throat tighten, her breath short, her world shrinking. She arrived home and collapsed on the living room floor. She cried like she hadn't cried since adolescence. She cried out of regret, out of selfishness, out of pride, for everything she had been, for everything she had destroyed. But what hurt most was knowing that none of it would bring Ethan back. And that even if he did, he was no longer hers. He belonged to someone else. In the days that followed, she tried to get back on her feet. She scheduled therapy, started painting again, and tried to fill her time. But every attempt felt artificial. Everything was an attempt. And they all failed. A month later, she ran into a mutual friend she hadn't seen in a while. They sat at a cafe to catch up, and the conversation inevitably turned to Ethan. The friend, with a cool delicacy, revealed something Claire never imagined she'd hear. She said that, weeks before dinner, the man Claire had cheated on her with, the one she believed she'd gotten involved with out of desire, need, or confusion, had contacted Ethan. Claire's blood ran cold. Her friend explained that she didn't know the details, only that Ethan had received an anonymous call, and after that, he'd changed completely. He seemed calm, centered, determined. As if he'd heard something that had shaken him of any illusions. Claire tried to piece things together, but nothing made sense. What was that call? And why hadn't she known about it? The answer came through a stroke of luck as cruel as it was revealing. Months later, while searching for an old book in the school library, she found a notebook she hadn't seen in years. Inside, a letter. Dated almost a year before the end of her marriage. It was a letter from Ethan himself. But not to her. It was to the man with whom she'd cheated on him. She'd never known the letter existed. And when she read it, the ground dropped out from under her feet. In the letter, Ethan said he knew. That he had discovered. That he didn't need physical proof to know when the love of his life had already given herself to another. He spoke about what it was like to love in silence, about the pain of sleeping next to someone who no longer belongs to us, and about the superhuman effort he made to keep from going mad. But what surprised Claire most was the final passage, where he said he forgave the other man, not out of pity, but because he had already taken from her what mattered most, the truth. And the truth, once lost, takes everything with it. He said he wouldn't fight, wouldn't make a scene, wouldn't compete. Because true love isn't fought for. It's recognized. And if hers no longer recognized him, he would accept it. Claire held the letter with trembling hands. It was as if each word was a mirror showing the woman she had become. A woman who lied, deceived, destroyed. And all for something that didn't even last. That was the night she understood the karma fate had in store for her. It wasn't public. It wasn't humiliating. It was discreet, internal, subtle. But as devastating as any punishment. The true punishment was seeing, with her own eyes, the man she destroyed become a better man without her. Seeing the love he offered being given, with even greater intensity, to someone else. And knowing, deep down, that I would never be loved that way again. And the cruelest part? Knowing that time would not bring reparation. That no letter, message, tear, or gesture could erase the truth. Because love, once betrayed, can even be forgiven. But it will never be the same. And sometimes, forgiveness comes only so the door can be closed for good. That morning, Claire turned off the lights, sat on the couch, and stared into space for hours. Her phone in hand, opened to an old photo of Ethan smiling on a random afternoon, holding a mug of coffee. It was the smile of someone who trusted. Of someone who believed. And she destroyed it. The next morning, he sent a single message. Short. Simple. Unpretentious. Thank you for loving me like no one else ever will. Ethan read it hours later. He smiled, closed his phone, and didn't reply. Because sometimes silence is the only answer left. And the most definitive. The phone remained on the kitchen table for days, its screen dark, as if the silence of the lack of response were heavier than any words that could be spoken. Claire, after sending that brief message, didn't expect a reply, but the lack of response still pierced her slowly, like a cold blade piercing through layers of regret. The world around her continued to function, people continued to smile, make plans, love, betray, be happy or unhappy in their own circumstances. But for her, time seemed frozen around that last sentence. It wasn't an apology, nor a plea. It was a confession with no return. A bitter acceptance that she would never be looked at the same way again. That she had lost the privilege of being remembered with tenderness. And this, more than any punishment, became her greatest dilemma, how to continue living knowing she had been the author of her own downfall. Little by little, close friends began to drift away. Not out of cruelty, but out of discomfort. It was difficult to maintain contact with someone who carried such visible, disconcerting regret. Claire became an unfinished portrait, someone who had lost her original form and now hid beneath layers of silence. In the school hallways, she walked with measured steps, her eyes lowered, avoiding eye contact. Her classmates whispered, as people do when they think they know the whole story. But no one knew. No one knew what it was like to wake up in the middle of the night with his name on their lips. No one knew what it was like to hear laughter in the street and, for a second, think it was his laughter. No one knew the weight of lying on a pillow where only the echo of a name that would never return remained. Meanwhile, Ethan continued. Not perfectly, but truly. There were days when the past would resurface like an old scent, a vague memory, a fleeting scene flashing through his mind. But it was no longer an open wound. It was simply part of a story that, however painful, had taught him to respect his own peace. With his new partner, he built something different, not an attempt to replicate the past, but a mature version of what it means to share your life with someone. It was a love that didn't require daily tests or constant repairs. It was peaceful. And this tranquility was the greatest victory for those who have known torment. One afternoon, while sorting through some old books, Ethan found a worn-cover notebook. Flipping through the pages, she came across notes she'd made early in their marriage. Shopping lists, travel plans, ideas for celebrating anniversaries. There was a disarming simplicity there, an optimism that now seemed distant, almost naive. He closed the notebook slowly and felt a pang in his chest, but it wasn't pain. It was longing for who he was back then. The man who believed that love would always be enough. But as he looked ahead, he saw that that man, even wounded, had evolved. He had scars, yes, but also wisdom. He knew who deserved his affection. And that, now, was what guided him. As Claire sank into her own memories, she began to frequent the park where they used to walk on Sundays. She always sat on the same bench, the third in the row near the lake, and watched the couples pass by. Sometimes she saw men who looked like Ethan, and her heart raced before she realized her mistake. It was as if she were searching for his features in strangers' faces, trying to find a familiarity that time had stolen from her. One such day, an elderly woman sat next to her. The two were silent for a few minutes, until the woman said, in a hoarse voice, that she liked to observe people still choosing themselves. Claire smiled sideways and said she had been one of those people, until she stopped choosing and realized too late what she was holding in her hands. The woman simply nodded, as if she understood more than she was saying. And before standing up, he lightly touched Claire's arm and said that sometimes the price of a wrong choice is not loneliness, but the full knowledge that true love is too rare to waste. They were simple words, but they pierced her like needles. Ever since that brief conversation, Claire began writing. She filled notebooks with rants, memories, scenes from the good times, and details of where things began to fade. It was her way of not forgetting. Not that he still wanted to return. She knew there was no going back. But she needed to remember, because forgetting would mean allowing everything to be in vain. And, somehow, writing was her attempt to salvage something, even if it was her own lucidity. A dilemma began to grow within her as the months passed. She knew Ethan was fine, she knew he'd found someone who made him smile, but a part of her wondered if she should tell him everything. About the letter, about what she'd discovered, about the true moment he'd known everything. There was something about his decision, to say nothing, to remain silent, that confronted her every day. Would he have done the same if she'd confessed? Would the ending have been different? Could their love have been salvaged if the truth had existed before the discovery? These questions haunted her. She practiced writing a letter for weeks. She wrote dozens of versions, some shorter, others longer and more poetic, trying to find the right tone between regret and gratitude. None seemed sufficient. None truly captured what she felt. Because what she felt was immeasurable. It was like trying to explain the weight of breathlessness, or the pain of an emotional amputation. There were no exact words. Deep down, she knew she wasn't writing to get a response. She wrote because she needed to say it. Because something inside her would only be stilled when he knew she understood everything. Too late, yes, but she understood. Ethan, on the other hand, faced a different dilemma. He had in his hands the chance to start over without resentment. He was faced with a woman who didn't hurt him, who understood him, who left no doubt. But there was a remnant of himself that still clung to the memory of who he had been. Not the pain, but the ideal of love he carried. Sometimes he wondered if it had been possible to avoid it all. If he should have insisted more, asked more questions, confronted it sooner. But he quickly dismissed these thoughts, because he understood that any struggle, to have meaning, must be fought by both parties. And at that time, he was fighting alone. Claire's moral dilemma grew. She was willing to accept the blame, but she didn't know if she should free Ethan from a secret he might have already overcome. Or if telling him now would simply be a way of trying to ease her own conscience. Writing the truth might feel like reopening wounds. But keeping quiet would deny him the chance to know everything, even the fact that her lover, in a strange wave of guilt, had called Ethan weeks before their dinner. And it was this call, not distrust, that had driven him to prepare the divorce papers so firmly. There were two paths before her, to tell or not to tell. And neither would bring back what was lost. Forgiveness had already been given. The end had already been sealed. But there was a need within her to show that, even if late, she finally understood how much she had failed. Not because she wanted him back. But because she wanted him to know that, in the end, she had loved. In the wrong, messy, selfish way. But she had loved. And loving someone like that, and yet destroying them, was something she would have to carry with her for the rest of her life. And it was in this confusion of feelings, in this spiral of silence and unspoken words, that the final decision approached. A choice not about starting over, but about how to end. Not about winning back, but about acknowledging. Because there are moments in life when there is no turning back, but there remains the right, and perhaps the duty, to look into the eyes of the one who was hurt and say, I was responsible. And even if love doesn't return, the truth, at least, will have its place. And maybe, just maybe, that's all that's left for those who lost the love of their life because they didn't know he was there all along, just asking to be seen. On that gray Thursday morning, Claire woke before her alarm. There was no longer any reason to stay in bed, nor the illusion that time would resolve the dilemmas that insisted on silently burrowing into her chest. The previous night had been another one of those nights where sleep came in fragments, interrupted by memories and scenes she'd rather forget, but which replayed themselves with surgical precision in her memory. His face, the sound of his voice, the way he adjusted his sleeves before leaving, everything was still vivid within her. But above all, there was the silence of the answer that never came. That definitive absence had transformed the pain into introspection, and now she felt that Ethan's forgiveness wasn't enough. Not until he learned how much she knew, how much she now understood what he'd lived through in silence. Claire had a decision to make, and she knew she couldn't put it off any longer. He poured the coffee without thinking, without even tasting it. His mind was occupied with words. Unwritten, unrehearsed. Words that came in a pulse, almost like irregular breathing. After weeks of ruminating on the idea, he decided it was time to seek him out once more. Not to get back together, not to try to undo the irreparable, but to finally conclude the story with the one thing that hadn't been between them in the end: truth. The raw truth, the one that tears but also frees. He wanted to tell you about the letter he'd found, about his lover's phone call, about what he'd discovered long after the night at the restaurant. You wanted to tell him you understood. That only now could you see who Ethan truly was in that relationship, a whole man facing a fragmented love. She'd learned from a mutual friend that he was attending a small community event at the neighborhood cultural center, something related to his new wife. Yes, they were now married, and his work in early childhood education. The news of their union had reached Claire like a sharp blade, not because she expected to get back together, but because it made it official, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that there was no longer any room for her, not even in the shadows of his memory. Even so, she decided to go. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that she wouldn't be welcome, but there was a burning urge in her heart to be honest, once and for all. And not for him. For her. For everything she'd neglected, for everything she'd destroyed, for everything she'd learned too late. She arrived at the venue wearing a discreet dress, her hair tied in a low bun, her eyes hiding sleepless nights. She watched from afar as he chatted with a few people, smiling lightly, naturally. There was a glow there she hadn't seen in a long time, perhaps ever. Beside him was his new wife, and Claire didn't have the courage to look at her for long. She was beautiful, but with a simple beauty, the kind of woman who needed no adornment to light up a room. There was something serene in the way she touched his arm as she spoke, as if that physical contact were part of breathing. Claire felt a knot in her stomach, but didn't let herself be carried away. She waited for the right moment, approached slowly, and called his name in a soft, almost whispered tone, as if apologizing for simply being there. Ethan turned and looked at her with restrained surprise. There was no anger, no discomfort. But there was no longing either. Just a steady mirror, reflecting who she was now in his eyes, a woman left in the past. She asked for a moment alone, and he gently excused himself from his wife, who discreetly stepped aside, offering space without showing any discomfort. They walked to a more secluded area of the cultural center, near one of the reading rooms. Claire hesitated for a moment, took a deep breath, and began to speak. There was no rehearsal, no script. Just raw, confused, and uncontainable feeling. She told him about the letter she found, about its impact on her, about the time it took her to understand his silence. She told him about the call her lover had made, about how he had known everything before he even saw her with another man. And she said, her voice breaking, that she now understood that his silence was the greatest act of love she had ever received. Because any other man would have exposed her, screamed, taken revenge. But he chose to preserve his own dignity without publicly hurting her. And this destroyed her inside, because she never lived up to such respect. Ethan remained silent almost the entire time, listening attentively, never looking away. When she finished, he waited a few seconds before responding. And what he said wasn't what Claire expected. He affirmed that, yes, he knew. He confirmed that the phone call had taken him by surprise, but that, instead of confronting her, he'd chosen to observe, to see for himself. Because part of him still wanted to be wrong. And when he was certain, he chose silence because he realized there was nothing more to say. That any explanation would be small compared to what he'd felt that morning when he saw her smiling with another man. He said forgiveness came with time, but it never meant forgetting. And that hearing that now didn't change anything, it only confirmed that he'd made the right choice in leaving. And upon hearing that, Claire felt something break definitively inside her. Because that was it. It was sealed. Nothing would change the destiny that had been set. She thanked him for listening, tears in her eyes, but without begging for anything. She just wanted him to know. And he knew. It was the end, finally, truly. Every word unspoken in the past had now been spoken. Every silence, translated. They said goodbye with a discreet wave. Ethan returned to the event, to his new world, to the woman who now occupied the place she had left. Claire walked slowly to the car, her heart beating heavier than before, but also with greater clarity. That pain wouldn't heal quickly, perhaps it would never heal completely, but at least now it no longer hurt with doubt. It hurt with loss. A loss she had brought upon herself, and which she now needed to accept. In the following months, Claire redirected her life. She began writing for a small local literary magazine, sharing chronicles and essays about feelings few people have the courage to name. Writing became more than a relief. It became her silent redemption. She didn't seek approval. She didn't want advice. She simply wanted to put into words what had nearly destroyed her. And, little by little, her writing began to attract attention. People who didn't know her personally wrote to thank her for describing pain they themselves didn't know how to express. And so, she found a new way to exist, through wounds transformed into art. Ethan continued to navigate his new phase with serenity. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no revenge in his actions. Only the clear conscience of someone who did what he could, who loved as far as possible, and then knew how to retreat without losing himself. With his new wife, he built a relationship based on dialogue, lightness, and presence. He learned to recognize the signs, to notice the silences, to appreciate the small gestures. He was a new man. Not because of her, but because he survived a breakup that nearly shattered him. Life now had a different rhythm. A different tone. And that tone was his. And even though they had both followed different paths, there was an invisible intersection where their stories continued to touch, not in the present, not in the future, but in what was left behind. And in that silent space between what was and what will never be again, a single certainty remained: true love, once mortally wounded, is not reborn the same. It may be remembered, it may be revered, but it will never be repeated. And for some, this truth is liberating. For others, it is the cruelest punishment of all. Time marched on like a river that never returns, sweeping away the last shreds of hope that once dwelt in Claire's heart. Years had passed since that final conversation between her and Ethan, and though the wound had stopped bleeding, the emptiness remained. It was like an abandoned house that never found a new inhabitant, a place where the echo of what once was still haunted the walls. Claire rebuilt her life silently, discreetly, as if she knew she no longer had the right to grand celebrations. She continued writing, now with more depth and less haste, and her weekly column became a must-read for people who saw themselves, in some way, reflected in her words. The pain she carried began to serve as a shelter for other wounded souls, and this gave her a sense of purpose. It wasn't redemption. It was simply a way to keep breathing. She never remarried. Not for lack of opportunities, but because something inside her had been permanently erased. He refused to build anything new on the rubble of what he had destroyed. Every attempt at a new beginning died before it could germinate. She felt she would never love anyone as intensely as she once loved Ethan, and that, by betraying him, she had forfeited her own right to that kind of love. She became a recluse, surrounded by books, plants, and carefully selected mementos. She avoided reunions, avoided places where she might encounter him, his new wife, any part of the life that had once belonged to her. Her existence became a space between commas, where everything had been said, but nothing concluded. In the few conversations she still had with old friends, she avoided talking about him. Not out of resentment, but out of reverence. Ethan had become a sacred chapter in her story, something not to be touched without respect. Something that would never return. Meanwhile, Ethan was moving in a different direction. Life, for him, had become fertile ground where small, everyday joys flourished. He now had a different family, built with care and maturity, where love wasn't made of promises, but of presence. The woman by his side was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. She didn't bring euphoria, didn't demand proof, didn't create unattainable expectations. She just was. And that was what made him love her, her constancy, her transparency, the fact that he never had to question whether he was enough. Together, they built a simple but true life. With short trips, long breakfasts, and sincere conversations late into the night. Ethan had learned to recognize the signs of heartbreak and no longer allowed ghosts from the past to prevent him from living in the present. He wasn't a bitter man. He was a man who, after nearly being destroyed, chose to rebuild himself with dignity. Years later, at a local literary event, Claire's name appeared as one of the guest authors. Ethan saw the poster by chance while walking with his daughter from his new marriage one random weekend. For a moment, he hesitated. Not because he wanted to see her, but because a part of him understood that this would be the last connection between them. The last time they would be, albeit silently, in the same room. He decided not to go. He smiled at the poster and continued walking, his daughter tugging at his hand and asking why he had suddenly stopped. He simply replied that he recognized an old acquaintance. And said nothing more. Because there was nothing more to say. Claire, for her part, noticed his absence. Deep down, she hoped he would appear. That he would read one of the texts and know that, albeit in different words, he was in every line. But he didn't. And that was, once again, confirmation of what she already knew: their story was over for good. One night, Claire wrote a text that moved readers across the country. It chronicled what it's like to lose someone still alive. About how some deaths don't happen with the body, but with absence. The text went viral, shared on forums, book clubs, and lectures. People wrote saying she had translated their greatest pains. But Ethan didn't read it. Not out of indifference, but because he learned that some words need to be left in the past. Sometimes, healing lies in not reopening wounds, even if they come in the form of poetry. The last time their paths crossed was brief, almost imperceptible. On a rainy morning, as Ethan dropped his daughter off at school, Claire walked down the same sidewalk, her hair wet and carrying an umbrella too small to protect her entire body. She saw him first. She stopped for a moment. She watched from afar. He didn't see her. He was laughing with his daughter, crouching down to tie her shoelace. There was a tenderness in that gesture that completely disarmed her. Claire stepped back, turned her back, and walked on. She cried, but not from pain. She cried because she understood that this was the end. An ending without a scene, without conversation, without formal closure. It was just that, two strangers who once loved each other deeply, crossing paths by chance in the midst of life. And heading in opposite directions. And that's how the story ended. Not with dramatic new beginnings, nor with unlikely reconciliations. But with the kind of ending that most closely resembles real life, one in which there isn't always justice, nor always complete healing, but always consequences. Claire continued writing, collecting praise from anonymous readers, living among the words that were now her only refuge. Ethan remained a present father, a caring husband, and above all, a man at peace. They both walked, but along paths that would never truly cross again. If you've made it this far, this story definitely touched you in some way. Comment below with your thoughts, what resonated with you most, and what, in your opinion, was the turning point for this couple. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any of the next impactful stories we've carefully prepared for you. And let this story serve as a reflection: betrayal doesn't begin with a hidden kiss or a lie told. It begins the moment someone stops choosing the other every day. It begins with silence, absence, and indifference. And when it's consummated, it doesn't just destroy trust. It destroys homes, stories, and futures that will never be the same. Betrayal tears up deep roots, and even with forgiveness, the flowers that once grew there will never have the same scent. Love is a choice. Caring is a choice. Cheating is a choice, too. And every choice has a price. This channel does not support any kind of betrayal. Here, truth and respect are the pillars of the stories we tell. May this space continue to be a reminder that love is only valuable when it's whole, and that once broken, it can't always be put back together.